Hello. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at section 5.4 in the textbook, which is solving linear equations still. These equations are a little bit more complicated than the ones in section 5.3 because they'll involve two separate steps for solving. I expect that you already have familiarized yourself with solving the equations in section 5.3, so if you haven't, please make sure to go back and watch that video and read through section 5.3 of the textbook to make sure you understand that process. Alright, so the directions here are going to say solve the linear equation just as before, and they'll have some fine print at the end about writing your answer as a decimal rounded to the hundredths place or a fraction in lowest terms. That fine print is important, so we'll make sure to pay attention to it at the end. Let's take a look at this first one. 2x plus 5 equals 17. So just like before, we have an equation, and just like before, that equal sign is going to split our equation into a left and right side. I like to draw a line down the middle, and I strongly encourage you to do the same. I can't force you to do it, but it does really help. And then my first step for solving equations is the same as before. I look at the side with the x or the variable on it, and I try to determine what the number and operation is on that side that I need to cancel. It looks like in this case, though, I have two numbers on the same side as x. X is on the left side of the equation, and there are two numbers over there, the 2 and the 5. So what do? When there's more than one number on the same side as x, you're always going to cancel out the addition or subtraction first and cancel out the multiplication last. The number that's touching that x is the coefficient. It's being multiplied with the x, and I'm going to cancel that out last by dividing. This should always be two separate and distinct steps. You really want to try to compartmentalize this into two separate pieces. Don't try to do everything at once because that's how mistakes happen. So let's see if we can work this out. I have two numbers on the same side as x. I have this 2 here, and I have this 5 here. Well, the 2 is definitely the number touching the x. It's right next to that x right here, and you can imagine a little multiplication dot in between them if you want to. That's the last to go. It's always the addition or subtraction, the number that has a plus or a minus sign between it and the x, that has to go first. So I look on the left side of the equation, and I'm going to choose the 5 to get rid of first. That has to be the first number that you cancel out. So to cancel out that plus 5, just like in the previous section, I'm going to use the opposite operation with the same number. So I'm still going to have a 5 underneath, but I want to cancel out a plus 5. So I'm going to use a minus 5 to do it. If I did it on the left side of my equation, I have to do it on the right side. So this is another place where that line comes in handy. The 5 is on the left side of the line, so I'm going to write another negative 5 on the right side of the line. Make sure you're writing the exact same thing on both sides. So the whole point of doing that is that the positive 5 and the negative 5 will cancel each other out. 5 minus 5 is just 0, in other words. And now I can go ahead and evaluate top to bottom. So this 2x over here doesn't have anything directly underneath it, so I'm going to bring it straight down. And this should be familiar with the questions that we did before. So 2x is going to come straight down. I'm going to bring down my equal sign as well. And I have to do 17 minus 5. Well, that's going to be 12. All right, stop and take a deep breath. You just did step 1. So here's step 1 of this two-step equation. The book doesn't call them two-step equations, by the way, but a lot of other textbooks do, so you might be familiar with that name. So that's step 1. All I did was what it said down there. I canceled out the addition or subtraction first. Always end each step with a full equation, meaning you need a left side, an equal sign, and a right side. And here's why. At this point, you could walk away from this equation, go grab a snack from the refrigerator, talk to your family a little bit, call your mom, I'm sure she misses you, and then come back to this, and you'll see a simple one-step equation. 2x equals 12. You don't have to pay attention to anything above that line. You've broken this down into two smaller and simpler steps, or equations, or problems if you want. So if you just look at it one step at a time, the equations aren't all that difficult to deal with. They're just like the ones that you did in the previous section. They're not any harder. It's just two questions back to back. So when I look at this, it says 2x equals 12, and I'll do that second part. I'm going to cancel out the number touching x by dividing. Well, that's what we did in the previous section, so it's not any different from what you've already done. So in this case, I'm going to cancel out the 2 that's touching the x by dividing, because if it's touching the x, it's understood to be multiplication. And just like before, we're going to use a fraction bar to indicate division. So I'm dividing by 2, and I did it on the left, so I have to also do it over here on the right. Well, just as before, when you cancel out the number with x, so you're going to cancel here. So 2 divided by 2 will cancel. Technically, 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1, but you don't have to write the 1 if it's in front of an x. And the x is just going to come straight down to the next line. So I have x, and then 12 divided by 2 is going to give me 6. So I have x equals 6, and that's my final answer here. I have x all alone on one side of the equal sign, so it's on its own, and then a number on the other side. So that's my solution, and that was step 2. So just make sure that you're ending each step with a full equation, and that the first step is always canceling your addition or subtraction, and the second step is canceling out your multiplication. Cancel out that coefficient, or the number that's touching your variable, by dividing. Alright, so fairly straightforward two-step equation. Let's take a look at this next one and see if we can work it out together. So just as before, I'm going to draw my line where my equal sign is, just so that I can split the left and the right sides visually. And I'm going to look on the side that has my variable x. Well, x is on the right side this time, but it doesn't change how we do things. There are two numbers on the same side as x. See if you can figure out which one you think you ought to cancel out first, and then cancel that number on both sides. Go ahead and hit pause, and when you resume, we'll do that step together. Okay, did you cancel out the right number? Let's see. There's two numbers on the right with the x. There's the 3, and then there's this 20. The 3 is touching the x, so that's my coefficient. That's the last to go. The 20 has a plus sign between it and the x, so that's actually the first one I want to cancel out. It's being added to the x. I cancel out a plus 20 with a minus 20. And I want to do it on both sides of the equation. Now careful now, you drew this line for a reason. That separates the left and right side. You're going to put your other minus 20 all the way over here on the other side of the equation. Don't put it with the 3 now, because that's also on the right side, the same side as the first one. So you wanted to make sure that you do both things, the same thing on both sides. Alright, when I evaluate now, I'm going to do 9 minus 20. Okay, so you got to remember those rules from section 1.9. These two things have different sign of the higher number. Since 20 is bigger than 9, I'm going to keep the negative sign here. 9 subtracted from 20 ought to give me 11. I'm going to bring down my equal sign because I want a full equation, and the 3x is also going to come down. Make sure that you have that when you're writing your work for this one, and make sure that you understand that that's an important part of this. You need to make sure that you bring that down. And when you're posting your homework assignment, that's also super important to write that full thing out. Now 20 minus 20 will just cancel out. You don't have to write the 0 there. Alright, so that's step 1 done. Great. We can move on to step 2. Again, this is a great time to take a break. Compartmentalize these questions. Don't feel like you have to do the whole thing at once. These two steps are separate and don't have to be thought of at the same time. Trying to do everything at once will just lead you to problems. Alright, so my last step, I'm going to take a look at the coefficient, the number that's touching the x, and that number that's touching the x is really being multiplied with x. That 3 that's touching the x is 3 times x, and so I'm going to have to cancel that out with a division. So just like before, we'll use a fraction bar to indicate division, and I'll write that divided by 3 underneath on both sides. Now, you're probably going to be trying to evaluate that with a calculator because 3 doesn't go into 11 nice and evenly. And so negative 11 divided by 3, well, a negative divided by a positive will give me another negative number. And then 11 divided by 3 doesn't quite go in cleanly. You're going to get something like, it's going to be 3, and I believe that's going to be something like 0.6666, and those 6's just keep on going forever and ever, don't they? That's a repeating decimal, and they're not very pleasant to deal with. Usually you have to round them off to something. Well, let's look at the fine print and see what it tells us. And right here it says round your decimal answer to the nearest hundredth if necessary. Well, my hundredths place is the second one after the decimal place. It goes tenths, then hundredths. So that's this 6. And I'm going to have to round that 6 up because it's followed by another 6. So my final answer would be negative 3.67. Now, if you remember for some of the previous sections, these rounding, the rounding at the end can really be a bit of a bear sometimes, and you have to be careful to make sure that you're rounding correctly. But the fine print also does say something about writing your answer as a fraction as a possibility. So watch this. This is a possible alternate way to write your answer. Right here. negative 11 over 3. Well, that's a perfectly good fraction. It's improper, but that's okay. It didn't say anything about writing it as a proper fraction. And as you know from previous assignments, the online homework actually prefers improper fractions to mixed numbers most of the times. All you have to do is make sure that that fraction is in lowest terms. And it is, because you can't divide 3 and 11 by the same thing. So negative 11 thirds is actually a perfectly acceptable answer for this one. Now, something that'll happen sometimes, a lot of the time students will prefer to answer as a decimal. If you type the wrong decimal into the Hawks homework software, it will tell you that it's wrong and it will give you the fraction that's correct. That doesn't mean you can't put in a decimal as your answer. That just means that the decimal you put in was incorrect. It's not going to give you both answers, it will only give you the fraction. But you could still have put in the correct decimal answer. So just be careful with the homework software and realize that you can actually answer with either of those two answers as long as it's the correct one. So negative 11 thirds and negative 3.67 would both be acceptable here. All right, so to summarize, solving equations in 2 steps from section 5.4. These are equations that will typically have more than one number on the same side as x. If you have more than one number on the same side of the equal sign as x, what you want to do is pay attention to which one is touching the x, so that's multiplication, and which one is being added or subtracted from x. Cancel out the addition or subtraction first by writing the same number with the opposite sign on both sides underneath. So you're doing the opposite operation, just like before. Do that as one step. Finish with the full equation, and take that full equation that you finished with and move on to step 2. Step 2 is to cancel the multiplication by dividing both sides by the coefficient. Make sure that you do these in 2 discrete steps and show all your work. Even if you're doing it for the Hawk software and you're not turning the homework into anyone, you still want to write these out so that you avoid mistakes. Last but not least, you can typically answer as a fraction or a decimal, but make sure to read the fine print about rounding or writing your answer in lowest terms.